Welcome to my second interview on YouTube. Today my guest is Daniel Weaver of BeeWeaver Apiaries. I'm Frederick Dunn, and thank you for keeping an open mind as we delve deeper into the topic of treatment-free beekeeping. I start by asking Daniel what his position is at BeeWeaver Apiaries.
Well, I am a co-owner and co-manager of BeeWeaver Apiaries.
Okay. So, co-owner. So who else? Who's?
Laura, my wife.
Oh, the queen bee. Yes.
The queen bee, yes.
Okay.
So BeeWeaver Apiaries is a successor to Weaver Apiaries and was established by my dad, Benford Weaver, and me in 1995. And one of the principal motivations for establishing BeeWeaver Apiaries as a separate company. And at that point, we took our leave from being in business with my uncle, my dad's brother, Roy Weaver Jr., and his son, Richard, principally because we wanted to double down on our efforts to select for honeybees that were resistant to Varroa mites. And I had already embarked on that project, and it was clear that it was going to entail some significant investment of financial resources in order to have success. And my cousin and my uncle didn't want to go down that path. They embraced a more conventional sort of apicultural practice in coping with Varroa mites of let's treat early and often and with increasing doses of acaricides. And I immediately discovered that I didn't want to have anything to do with that bandwagon. And so embarked in about 1992 in beginning a selection effort for bees that were resistant to Varroa. But it took a number of years for that effort to scale up and to gain traction. And so by 95, I was confident that we were going to enjoy success. And so we're we're in Grimes County. If you want to find, Grimes is one of 254 counties in Texas.
Okay.
It's northwest of Houston by about 70 miles.
Okay.
It is 120 miles due east of Austin and just south of Bryan College Station. That's where the headquarters is.
That's where the headquarters is.
We have bees scattered over a larger area, although nowhere near the scope of the geographic area that we once operated in. So again, I can back up and give as much history as you care for me to impart.
Well, the fundamental part is your philosophy about when you made this decision to go with genetic routes rather than treatment routes. I seem to recall that in one of your presentations on your website, and we'll of course link your YouTube channel in the description for those who want to see your presentations, which were about 10 or 11 years ago, I believe. You went away to school and came back with ideas about what you wanted to do with the bees and where you wanted to go as a company?
Yeah, I knew that the arrival of Africanized bees into Texas was imminent. I was fairly certain that sooner or later, and probably sooner, that Varroa mites would show up in the United States. And I was offered partnership at the law firm I was practicing with, and decided, instead of joining the firm and becoming a partner, I think I'd rather go back to the bee ranch with my dad and see where we're going to go from here, because I expected that, in fact, it was going to be quite a shock. Either one of those two events alone, the arrival of Africanized bees or Varroa mites, was going to radically change the industry. I didn't have a crystal ball, but it was pretty clear that Africanized bees were marching northward inexorably toward the Texas border, and there was no reason to believe that they would stop before they completely inundated our area as well. So in 1989, I left the practice of law full time, went back into the family business. Unfortunately, let me just give some more context. At the time, we were operating colonies in Texas in the springtime and raising lots of queens and package bees. And then we would take about half our colonies north to North Dakota for honey production in the summer. And so the first summer that I was back in the business, we moved colonies to North Dakota. And at the very same time, a Florida beekeeper who happened to have decided to flee the area where Varroa mites had just been discovered, moved illegally into North Dakota without any permits. And at the time, North Dakota was a registered location only state where you had to register your locations with the state in order to be able to occupy the ground legally. And there was a mile limitation. You couldn't encroach on any other's registered apiary.
Oh, so they had designated zones for beekeepers in North Dakota, and you had to have a permit to be within a mile of another established apiary?
Within 2 miles.
Within 2 miles. Does that still stand today?
No, I don't think so. No, I think they got rid of that. I think many North Dakota beekeepers regret that they got rid of that.
Okay.
But in any event, to cut to the chase, so what transpired is that this Florida beekeeper illegally moved colonies in and decided to dump them all right in the area where our operations were headquartered, central North Dakota, just east of Bismarck in Burley, Kidder, and Emmons County. And by the end of the summertime, the North Dakota authorities were going through and sampling, looking for Varroa mites, and they found Varroa mites in 2 of our apiaries, and ordered us to extirpate all the colonies in North Dakota that we had, which was going to be an unbelievably devastating economic loss.
Can you give us a ballpark of how many colonies we're talking about?
3,000, 3,500. And I negotiated, and we had many difficult conversations between the Texas authorities, the North Dakota authorities, us, and eventually they agreed that we would kill off all of our colonies within 10 miles of any apiary that was found to have Varroa mites, and then we could move the rest of the bees back to Texas.
Wow.
And so we ended up exterminating all but just under 1,000 of those colonies. I think we killed off about 2,500.
Wow.
And
so when you kill off colonies, like you kill off 2,500 colonies, what do you do with them after do you save the woodenware and stuff? Did you just euthanize the bees?
You do, but I mean, it's still an enormous problem.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to deal with combs full of brood and honey and trying to store those for the next year or transport them back to Texas once they were all, it was a disastrous situation, to put it bluntly.
Yeah, that would end some commercial beekeepers. That would be it.
Yeah. So, and coincidentally, just as we were finishing the extermination of those colonies in North Dakota, Varroa mites were discovered in Texas, only miles away from where we were operating in Texas. And at that time, we were occupying a large swath of Texas, from East Texas all the way to West Texas. And Africanized bees showed up at the very same time. So we were confronted with a double whammy. We managed to build back from those losses that we had sustained, but of course it cut into our production and revenue substantially for a period of time. And then dealing with Africanized bees was an entirely different problem, and one that was much more challenging than even we had anticipated, because it became clear early on that it was not just a matter of managing matings between our queens flying off and mating with Africanized drones, but it was a problem of having to contend with having colonies parasitized by an Africanized queen and a handful of bees. And
right. Sorry to stop you there. This is what we call a usurpation, when the Africanized bees move into an active colony and just take it over.
Yep.
So that started to happen with your apiary?
Africanized bee parasitism. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So at the time we were operating large numbers of colonies in Southwest Texas, south and west of San Antonio, and bore the brunt of the Africanized or New World African invasion as they crossed the Rio Grande and moved into that part of the world, particularly along the riparian corridors, where many of our colonies were located for obvious reasons, because it is a fairly arid part of Texas. And I can tell story after story about how extreme their behavior was and how it was so radically different that had I not known that they were honeybees, I would have characterized them as a completely different species. They were different in so many different ways. But the most important way is that when virgin queens left the hive, or mated queens left the hive with a handful of bees, they would fly to other colonies and literally glom onto the outside of the hive, a little walnut-sized ball of bees and a queen, and ingratiate themselves with the guard bees at the entrance. And then eventually the queen would make her way in the colony and execute our queen and take over. And we went from routinely requeening, half of our colonies every year, roughly, although for breeder queens that we were selecting, we would leave them in colonies for longer periods of time. But we usually tried to requeen about half our colonies every year. We went from that pace to having to replace queens in colonies 3 and 4 times a year in order to control activation. And that's how we were doing it. And so I decided that this perhaps was an opportunity for us to try to manage 2 completely different threats by very close phenotypic characterization of colonies, both behaviorally and with respect to their ability to tolerate mites, because we were going to have to contend with Africanized bees and we were going to be replacing queens frequently. We might as well be doing it and trying to accelerate our progress on selecting for Varroa resistance at the same time. So that, and I just, it made me sick to put poisons inside of colonies, right? I didn't like the idea of putting acaricides in hives where they could contaminate hive products and where they would undoubtedly have many deleterious effects, if not lethal effects, but nonetheless deleterious effects on bee behavior and colony function and physiological factors and a variety of other things. So I just talked to my dad and I said, look, I'm willing to bet the farm because I don't want to do beekeeping if that's what it's going to mean. If being a beekeeper is going to mean that I'm going to have to put toxins in my colonies multiple times a year in order to control Varroa mites, then it's not for me anyway. I'd rather try to do something worthwhile and attempt a genetic solution to the problem. So, and by 92, we got that effort off the ground and picked that year to leave 1,000 of our colonies without treatment in the hopes of finding the elusive few, and I knew they would be few, that exhibited some measure of resilience in the face of Varroa parasitism. And we did that and identified what I thought were some pretty good candidates. And then the subsequent year, when we had progeny of those queens to screen, it became clear that it was actually a much more difficult exercise to identify queens that truly exhibited a resistant phenotype than I had imagined. So of the, I think it was 9 breeder queens that I was confident were Varroa resistant, well, only 5 of them turned out to be truly, measurably, markedly better at tolerating Varroa parasitism.
And can you define what it is to tolerate Varroa parasitism? In what way were they demonstrating that?
So survival for a year without treatment was my first metric. Okay. I wanted colonies that would go into winter, even carrying a Varroa load, but would go into winter, survive winter, and emerge next spring and be able to begin expanding again. So that was the selection criteria for the first several years that I was engaged in that project. But, and by the way, nearly everyone said I was crazy.
Mhm.
right? There were some famous bee scientists that said I was crazy
Yeah,
to do. On the other hand, there were some other bee scientists that were going down the same path, right?
great.
So there was John Harbaugh and Jeff Harris at USDA Baton Rouge with their, at the time, SMR bees, suppressing mite reproduction. They subsequently became renamed VSH bees, Varroa sensitive
Sensitive
hygiene.
hygienic. Yeah.
And there was Tom Renderer with his Russian bee project. And so it's not like I was a lone wolf out there, but
Right.
the great majority of those entomologists who felt like they knew what they were talking about were skeptical that this was going to be easily accomplished, that
Hmm.
a genetic solution could be found for
Hmm.
Varroa parasitism. And so I was convinced we could do it. And why? Well, we had already had experience with buckfast bees.
Hmm.
We had begun collaborating with Brother Adam when I was still a boy, right after I first started working in the queen yards as a kid, catching
Oh,
queens
really?
on Saturday mornings. And by 1967, we had made a deal with Brother Adam to produce large numbers of buckfast queens in the U.S. through queens and semen that were imported through the bee quarantine facility at the University of Guelph in Guelph, Ontario.
Hmm.
And then for many years had produced buckfast bees prior to the arrival of tracheal mites in the U.S. And, buckfast they had certain attributes that made them of particular value to beekeepers in northern climates, even before the arrival of tracheal mites here in the U.S.
Hmm.
They tended to hoard more winter stores around the brood nest. They were really good at packing in pollen around the last vestiges of brood as winter approached. And they were much slower to emerge from winter cluster once spring hit. So they were less likely to succumb to that late freeze
Hmm.
or pollen dearth that so often occurs in early springtime in North America and around the world.
Hmm.
So by the mid 70s, we had begun to sell a large number of buckfast queens, and they were prized for those particular qualities, right? And then tracheal mites got to the U.S., and it was a good thing we were producing buckfast queens because
Hmm.
tracheal mites killed lots and lots of colonies in the U.S. once they got here.
Yeah, a
And
lot of new beekeepers don't realize how devastating the tracheal mites were. And didn't they knock out like 80% of some managed colonies of bees?
some in some operations, yes, yeah. So when Roger Morse was still attending bee meetings, professor at Cornell University many years ago, right after, not right after, but some substantial period of time, I think about 6 or 7 years after tracheal mites arrival, Roger got up at a bee meeting and insisted that he have the podium and got up and wanted to congratulate my dad, my uncle, me, my cousin, Weaver Apiaries, and Brother Adam for having had the foresight to have a buckfast breeding program going in North America when
Hmm.
tracheal mites got here. So having seen that it was possible to have Mother Nature and natural selection help you find bees that could cope with an exotic pest like tracheal mites,
Hmm.
gave me some measure of confidence that we could do the same thing with Varroa mites. More than that,
Hmm.
my background in genetics also gave me encouragement when I thought about how Varroa mites reproduce in the colony. And you'll recall that Varroa mites reproduce preferentially on drone brood.
Hmm.
And drones are usually the most heavily infested and most quickly infested brood in the colony.
Hmm.
And you'll also know that drones are haploid. They only carry one set of chromosomes. So in a sense, the entire genome of the drone is exposed to selection. And it's the reproductive member that passes one set of genomic information on to their offspring.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have intense natural selection focused on a single haplotype of the bee genome, and only those who are able to cope with Varroa parasitism, escape intense parasitism, and emerge capable of producing substantial quantities of semen will be able to pass on those traits to their offspring.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that was going to be our ace in the hole. And I don't know. If it had gone the other way, you could have just counted me the fool, right? But
Mm-hmm.
as it developed, we were able to screen and select for honeybees that were measurably more tolerant of or resistant to Varroa mites. And I'll go on to add that I was desperately searching for ways to accelerate the process, because it's very tedious to have to go through an entire generation before you can see and measure what progress, if any, you may have made.
Right, because
Right?
for those that don't understand what that means is not only does the queen have to be mated and have those traits, but we have to raise offspring and see those mature so we understand what their behaviors are. Is that right?
That's right. That's it
So,
in a nutshell.
yeah.
It takes a full generation before you can really know whether you're making any progress.
Right.
And
Yeah.
for practical matters, for most beekeepers, that's a year at least, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but I became. We went from having sticky boards under huge numbers of colonies and doing lots of ether rolls to just having, me in particular, developing a skill set where I could look at colonies, and if I saw a certain density of phoretic mites on adult bees, I knew that this was a no-go. It was time to get rid of this queen. There's
Right,
no
because by
sense
the
in
time you
looking.
can see them, that's a
Yeah, it's
heavily
usually
infested colony.
right. And then beyond that, it also became clear to me that another way that I could accelerate the phenotypic screening to identify colonies that were more likely than not to carry some measure of Varroa resistance was if a colony exhibited appreciable numbers of deformed wing bees, go ahead and get rid of her.
Mm-hmm.
She is not going to be able to survive long term. And so I think fortuitously, I began to select both for bees that were resistant to deformed wing virus as sort of a proxy for Varroa parasitism. And as we now know, it's deformed wing virus that actually causes bee mortality. As devastating as the Varroa parasitism and sucking on hemolymph and fat bodies is, well, deformed wing virus more often than not is the actual cause of colony morbidity, mortality.
And what a lot of people know as PMS, parasitic mite syndrome.
Right. Deformed wing bees, lots of deformed wing bees. And go ahead, just, I could cut to the chase at that point and go ahead and say, okay, that queen is not making it into the breeding program.
Right.
Let's go ahead and place her. So the other ace that we had in our back pocket was that my forefathers had the wisdom to make sure that we had an extraordinarily diverse genetic background in our stock all along. So back in the 1880s, when my great uncle gave 10 hives of bees to my great grandparents, Zach and Florence, as a wedding gift, he had already been keeping bees in Grimes County for about 10 years. And his stock was a hybrid of Apis mellifera ligustica, one of the earlier.
So the Italians, yeah.
Italians are Carniolans, and Apis mellifera, or the Northern European or German bee, were the foundation of the stock locally in Texas at that time. And then subsequently, my grandfather, Roy Weaver Sr., brought in bees from the Caucasus region of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. So he brought in bees from Anatolia and Turkey and Georgia. And so before Africanized bees ever got here, we had Apis mellifera mellifera, Apis mellifera ligustica, and Apis mellifera caucasica in our genetic background. And then when Africanized bees got here, we also had Apis mellifera scutellata.
Yeah.
And we were I was involved in organizing and obtaining funding and conducting the Honeybee Genome Project. In fact, one of our queens was used as the source material for the Honeybee Genome Project. And one of the papers that was published as a companion to the Honeybee Genome release was in Science in 2006, called Thrice Out of Africa. And there are 5 managed colonies that are part of the data set in that paper, and they're 5 BeeWeaver breeder queens. And if you look at the population structure, they carry major signatures of all 4 of those honeybee subspecies. So I feel like that genetic diversity was a huge advantage, having that to work with.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have to have genomic variability in the population if you're going to have intense selection pressure that's going to be cutting down on the diversity of that genetic background eventually. So I was very blessed to have had a number of very wise ancestors who understood that sort of inherently.
Mm-hmm.
Genetic diversity is good.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we jump forward a little bit today, that's fantastic history, by the way. And the Caucasian bees and everything they're still talked about now. Are you collaborating at all with any of the other treatment-free genetic researchers? Are there other names? Because, for example, if you look at a list of known Varroa resistant stock, they list, the Purdue ankle biters and everything else. Are you at all collaborating with any of those, or are you pretty much on your own with your line and with your continuing your genetics?
I would characterize it as pretty much on my own, but I have always worked with other researchers in the community to share ideas. And, I've occasionally sent queens to some other bee scientists and have gotten some stock from some other people who are working down the same path. Mm-hmm. Most significantly, back in the late 1990s, we collaborated extensively with John Harbaugh and Jeff Harris on their mm-hmm. SMR project, which became, Varroa sensitive hygiene once the phenotype was better characterized. And we also raised Russian queens and produced Russian queens in collaboration with the Russian breeding program. Mm-hmm. But it was my view pretty early on that we were making faster headway with our own selection program. And we were producing queens that were not just surviving Varroa parasitism, which mm-hmm. SMR and Russian bees would do, mm-hmm. but that the colony would thrive at a level that we did not find in the what we then called smart bees, SMR, SMART, smart bees, mm-hmm. and Russians. So although they would survive Varroa parasitism, they were small colonies that didn't grow very quickly and didn't produce very much honey, mm-hmm. and that we couldn't really harvest bees from for bee production or queen production either. Mm-hmm. So by the early 2000s, I think 2003 was the last year that we collaborated with those 2 breeding programs officially, in the sense of producing Russian queens and SMR queens as they were mm-hmm. known then. But I mean, I've talked with Greg Hunt at Purdue for years. I've worked with Diana Cox Foster, I've collaborated extensively with Jay Evans at the USDA Beltsville Bee Lab and Judy Chen and others, as well as bee scientists that are not at the USDA Bee Labs, but are at other places. So,
can you, for someone, a lot of my viewers are beginners, intermediate beekeepers. And when we mention a colony that just survives, that's small, maybe a single deep box or something like that, compare that with what would a thriving colony look like?
Well, surviving as a one deep box is fine, as long as it'll grow out quickly once spring arrives, right? So we often winter some colonies as 1-stories, not often. We prefer 2-story colonies, 2 deeps.
And that's when you say 2 stories, that's 2 deeps or a deep and a medium, or
2 deeps.
2 deeps. Okay.
Yeah, we have all different configurations. We tend to super and configure our colonies with equipment as they need it. So if the colony's small going into winter, if it was, just established from a nuke or a late split, or we took too much honey off of it, whatever, we may carry it through winter as a 1-story. That's okay, but we want it to grow quickly the following year. Our problem is that we were seeing too many queens with these other pedigrees that, okay, they overwintered as a 1-story, but it was May before we got them into a second deep. And, in Texas, when we're trying to rear queens and have queens available to sell by the last week in March, that's far too late. So we prefer to have colonies that are, when the first pollen flow begins, and it used to be more predictable than it is now. Now with climate change, it's very much heightened variance on when we're going to experience the first pollen flow and when colonies are going to begin to build up. But we're not going to start raising queens until we've got colonies with 5 and 6 combs of brood in them, which is basically 2 full depth Langstroth hive bodies full of bees and honey and as much brood as the queen has been able to produce at that point, and then continue to grow them from there. So if I see a colony that I would say thrived, I would say, okay, it's grown quickly in springtime. We've been able to harvest bees from it for our bee production so that we can produce packages or swarms to sell to other beekeepers. We can produce colony nuclei to sell to other beekeepers. We can make splits of our own, and then we can go produce a honey crop. And if they can do that, then that's thriving.
And that's your genetic stock going forward.
That's okay. Those are the ones I want. And so for the first years of the Varroa breeding program, it was a long time before we got colonies that survived and thrived, right? I was able to go to the Apimondia meeting in Vancouver in 1999 and show slides. PowerPoints were not really a thing yet, of colonies in North Dakota that had been without any chemical treatment for years, and they were stacked with honey supers higher than I could reach. And that is the definition of a colony that thrives. And incidentally, after giving my presentation there in Vancouver, I had a gentleman in the front row stand up and say, "You're a liar," in an auditorium with thousands of people, because at the time that was heresy. People thought that it was crazy to think that you could keep colonies alive without treating them with chemical acaricides, pulling drone brood from them, and doing lots of other things to manage Varroa. So anyway, it was only by about then, that was when I really knew we had hit it. We had really hit it, because all the colonies that we moved to North Dakota made huge honey crops, and nearly all survived. And that was big, but it took 7 years.
7 years of letting colonies fail and then working exclusively with those that succeeded. And what percentage were you dealing with that were making it as compared to those that were not?
Well, let's see. 10 out of 1,000 would be what, 0.1%?
Wow. Yeah, that's devastating.
No, 1%. 1%.
Yeah.
So, yeah, from 1% or less, and remember, half of those turned out not to be really Varroa resistant. So 0.5% to, now I like to think that the number of colonies that we produce that are vulnerable to Varroa are, in the single digit percentage wise. And why? Well, unavoidable mismatings with other bees in our vicinity that are not Varroa resistant, or, failure to intercept queens that are not truly of our pedigree, a virgin that moves in from a swarm from another colony, as opposed to being from a queen cell that we've introduced to a mating nuke. Things happen in the natural world that always, disrupt plans. But I think
so are all of your queens open mated, or are you doing any insemination, or
they're all open mated at this point?
they're all open mated?
Yep.
So then, do you have breeding yards that are well away or as far as you can get from other competing genetics?
We try. We do the best that we can. It's increasingly problematic, principally from a land use and developmental encroachment perspective. So the part of Texas that we operate in now, we don't have as many bees out in far west Texas as we once did. Very few, in fact. And we're mostly in the vicinity of central and southeast Texas. And that area is growing so rapidly that so many places where we used to have hundreds of colonies and we're able to get far, far away from other beekeepers are now rooftops, concrete, asphalt, big box stores, and suburban development.
Wow.
And we do the best that we can, but it's increasingly difficult to find areas that are as isolated as we once could locate. It's one of the things that we struggle with, but we do our best. We try really hard.
Wow. Can we stop for just a second? You're basically in total darkness. Do you have a light or something? A light or something. People are just seeing this dark figure in the shadows.
Oh, good grief. I apologize.
No, that's okay. It won't matter to the podcasters.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, you were just like in the
In the
I
dark.
thought we were doing The Godfather or something there for a minute.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. Okay, so we'll keep our train of thought.
Let's see.
So you're talking about geographic isolation so that we could have mating yards, and I'm sure you have separate drone yards. And
yeah, so
how do you do that?
Yeah, the way we typically set things up is we'll have a drone mother yard that's right there in the mating yard. So we'll have a full size apiary of 50 or 60 colonies, 50 or 60 strong colonies that are producing lots and lots of drones in the midst of the mating nukes that we have in that same apiary. And we try to have those in a fairly condensed area. So when we set up a mating apiary, we like to have 2 or 3 in close proximity to one another within 2 or 3 miles, so that we can share sort of a buffer zone, if you will, to protect our drones from.
So that's a question some people may have. How big is your operation actually now? Is your main product queens and packages and nukes?
Bees and queens and nukes. Yeah.
Okay, so that is your primary product.
Yeah, we used to have a significant honey production operation too, both in Texas and in other states. But I decided to downsize a few years ago when I realized I was spending far too much time away from home and my family, working too much. So both producing bees and queens and chasing a honey crop in other states and far parts of Texas became more than I was willing to put up with.
Okay.
So we still produce some honey, but
okay,
not the volumes of honey that we once did. The average production in Texas is down compared to historical averages too, for all the reasons that I previously mentioned.
For low rainfall and everything else as well, right?
Yeah. climate variability, and just encroachment by development, conversion of wild areas and farmland that was left fallow to, suburbia.
Now, you would think as big as Texas is, it just in my head, I'm not seeing concrete jungles, but
Well, there's some parts of Texas where there's still not huge population density, but those parts of Texas are not particularly conducive to queen rearing either.
right.
I mean, once you get west of the Balcones Escarpment in Texas, which runs through Austin and San Antonio, San Marcos, Waco, you get west of that line, it gets a lot harder to produce queens.
Mm-hmm. Now, what do you know about the concentrations of the Africanized bees? In other words, are they incapable of prospering in these arid areas, or do you know where they're concentrated?
The riparian corridors in arid areas were where Africanized bees moved. They moved up and down river valleys.
Okay.
And then spread out in areas where they could find other resources. Mm-hmm. But the feral colony density of Africanized bees, we have feral colonies now that are both Africanized and non-Africanized. Mm-hmm. And the number of feral colonies that are Africanized has gone from 100% in the mid-1990s when Varroa mites decimated the European feral honeybee population in Texas.
Yeah.
There were none left. And so it was a perfect recipe for rapid spread of New World African bees across the landscape because they didn't have any competition for resources. They mostly just had, dead colonies, many of them provisioned with honey to jump in and occupy. So feral colonies today that are Africanized are much less common, and the degree of defensive behavior that those feral Africanized colonies exhibit is much less dramatic than it once was. So you only scarcely encounter the truly frighteningly vicious colonies that were once abundant. More likely than not, if you bumped into a colony that was Africanized, it would come at you a quarter mile before you got to the bee yard. There'd be bees bouncing off your windshield trying to get in your truck to sting you.
Wow.
Before you got to the bee yard. And after you'd been in the bee yard, they'd follow you for 2 miles.
That's
it was nuts. It was completely nuts back in the day.
So then let's fast forward to today. There was a paper recently published that included BeeWeaver bees in it, where they talked about the Varroa living with the bees, and the bees were just not impeded by the presence of Varroa. Is that a paper that you're familiar with?
I'm not sure which one you're talking about, but I know there have been some published.
Like this year, I think it was published this year, and I was pretty excited about it because they named BeeWeaver, and they talked about, and you kind of alluded to this early on, it wasn't that you eliminated Varroa destructor mites from the colonies, but rather that the bees were coming through in the presence of these mites without being negatively impacted. Is that right?
That's been the story all along.
Okay.
I'm happy that it's being published that way now too.
Yeah.
I was an author on a paper published back in October of last year.
Okay.
Where we looked at BeeWeaver bees and compared them to other bees. And we did lots of RNA sequencing to look at the gene expression patterns, comparing the two. And we were motivated by our early observations that BeeWeaver bees carried lower latent viral loads than other honeybees that are commercially available and widely used. So the number of virus present in BeeWeaver bees, even when Varroa mites were present, was not nearly so high as the natural viral load carried by other honeybees. And the other honeybees in the study tended to show a very rapid increase in viral load when Varroa mites were present, whereas BeeWeaver bees did not show such an increase in viral load when Varroa mites were present. So we went on to characterize and compare those bees that were resistant to mites and viruses, and developed what I think are some important insights that hopefully will help other people replicate the work that we've done and get to the bottom of the precise mechanisms that explain how these bees are able to cope with mites and viruses and not perish. But you may have been talking about another paper.
Oh, no, it does. Well, yeah, I don't know. I have to look it up because I didn't have it handy. But it was recent, so I think it was referenced in either the American Bee Journal or Bee Culture. I'm not sure which, but I can certainly Google Scholar, and look it up.
Yep.
But so let's get at these. Are because I teach about bees a lot, and I would like to touch on this too while I have you on. A lot of people think that I send people to BeeWeaver for queen stock because I may have some affiliation with you guys, and I just want to clarify that I don't have any affiliation agreement with you, and I'm not compensated. I arrived at your stock because I was doing my research on people that were dealing with survivor bees and treatment-free beekeeping, and your family history was very appealing to me. I've only been a beekeeper since 2006, so I'm new to it, but I've sent just about everybody I know that wants a queen. I send them to you, to BeeWeaver. And then there's some pushback from other people that have had them maybe 10 years ago or 11 years ago and said that those queens will produce hot stock. Has that been the case in the past? And then has the temperament calmed down with what you're shipping out today, or how has it changed?
Well, let me begin by, first of all, verifying that you and I just talked for the very first time 2 days ago.
Yeah.
And no, you're not getting any commission. You're not affiliated with the company. So yeah,
I did get a patch one time in the mail with one of them.
Oh, well,
okay.
But you probably earned that because you bought X number of queens. I have no idea.
That's right.
But yeah, so I'll concede that when Africanized bees were everywhere in Texas, it was very, very hard to modulate the temperament of our bees and their defensive behavior to the levels that we had previously. And there was a time period from the early 1990s through the mid-O's, let's say, where our bees on average were more defensive than I would have liked. And we would occasionally get people complaining about their colonies being too temperamental, too defensive, too hot, if you will, for them to be able to manage. Our own experience is, if you know how to use a bee smoker, and even before Africanized bees got here, our bees were not so calm as some California or Florida Italians, where you don't even have to use the smoker. You can just go in the hive and start pulling combs out. You always had to use smoke with our bees. They were always a little bit more defensive if provoked with rough handling or failure to use smoke. But in our own experience, and maybe it's because we knew how to use smokers, we didn't think it was that bad. But yeah, I can see that some people thought that our bees were too defensive to put up with. And that's entirely their prerogative to value that over all else. But for me, it was more important to have selected bees that could survive and thrive in the face of Varroa parasitism and that didn't succumb to viruses. And I began to work hard at trying to regain some of the uniformly gentle behavior that our stock had previously exhibited at about the 2001 time period. And I think that if you talk to anybody who's had any experience with queen rearing and breeding bees, if you try to do too much at once, you're going to have a real hard time making headway. And looking back on it, I'm almost certain that if I had stopped in the mid 90s and said, wait a minute, things are getting too defensive. We've got to go back to recover the gentleness. We never would have gotten there to Varroa resistance. We wouldn't have made it. I had to keep a almost singular focus on that for a sustained period of time. And in the process, and part of that is just the fact of we are where we are in the middle of Texas, which became the place that became most heavily affected, unpleasantly affected by New World African invasion. And we bore the brunt of it. And it probably showed up in our stock and would have showed up in our stock regardless of our Varroa selection process. But I feel like that for the past 10 plus years, our bees are extremely gentle. I mean, if you go on our website, I think you can find, so we moved our residential address to Austin in 2006. And I think the following spring in 2007, I had 5 or 6 colonies on the front porch, literally on the front porch of our house in Austin, where you had to walk past them to get to the front door. Anybody that came, the mailman, the UPS driver, friends, family, the kids next door, they all had to walk past those colonies to get there. We didn't have any problems with defensive behavior and people getting stung. And I could go out and work them in a short sleeve shirt and short pants.
Well, I can say that I work them all last year without gloves. So they're, I mean, whatever they're doing right now is good. And the other good news was early on after I got a bunch of queens from you guys, I got inspected by the state inspector. And he almost didn't believe, I put that inspection video on YouTube, by the way, to show people what to expect when the Department of Agriculture sends an inspector to your apiary. And he gave up on finding mites. So it wasn't that so they're genetically supposed to survive with mites, but mine were without mites. He found 1 out of 10 colonies.
Yeah.
So, and I told him that's those survivor bees from Texas, and he just didn't believe almost that they weren't treated or something. But they've been very clean, and the ones I work with now are very calm. So if you were looking at a map of the United States and you're shipping out Weaver queens, where would you say they're best suited environment wise and temperature parameter wise?
Well, I like to think that they do well almost anywhere. We used to pride ourselves on being able to say that we had the ability to have colonies in North Dakota and Montana and, personally verify that they were thriving in those climatic conditions too, not just in Texas. Now I have to rely on customers to give me feedback. And I still have customers all across the northern tier of the country, all the way out to the West Coast and along the eastern seaboard that like to send me records about how we did. And I think we're still doing real well. It's not like I can say that if you're north of 50 degrees north latitude that you're too far north. I don't know how to answer the question, to tell you the truth.
Well, I can say that I live in the snow belt. You look out my window right now, everything's iced over. And the reason I ask you is, I guess, so it's based on feedback, because they survive here, they do well here, and they come out in the spring strong. And they were doing better than Italians. Italians were not well suited to the cold climate because they just had too big a brood pattern going into winter. And they also started too soon, where the Weaver stock has done really well here. So, but I'm whatever percentage wise, whatever I would tell you about would just almost be insignificant because my apiary is only 20 bee colonies. So, but that's a question I ask because people are going to ask when they see the video, where are they good for? Yeah. So that's pretty good. And the Buckfast genetics now, are you saying those are out of your stock or they're just very distant
No, they're there. It's just that we
They're there.
don't purport to sell buckfast bees or queens and haven't
Right.
for many, many, many years. I think, I mean, we stopped selling buckfast right after my dad and I farmed our own operation. We felt like it was disingenuous to do so because we were no longer getting buckfast semen for Brother Adam
Okay.
as we had for years. For many years back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we would routinely get semen, artificially inseminate some breeder queens, and we could, be confident that we had true buckfast genetics going on. But after that, we were kind of on our own, and we were able to keep them going somewhat as a separate strain, if you will, for a number of years. But at some point, we felt like things were so homogenized that it was almost dishonest to claim that we were selling buckfast bees and queens. We didn't have separate mating apiaries with only buckfast drone mothers in them. It was all kind of mixed up, if you will, super hybridized. And so we just started calling what we sell BeeWeaver queens.
So what time of year do you start shipping queens?
Well, if you're lucky enough to get an early order in, and if we're lucky enough to start grafting on time, we'd like to have queens available by the end of March. This year is shaped up to be a very late spring in our part of Texas. The bees are just now beginning to build up and brood. So we'd like to be grafting by the 21st of February. But this year, it'll almost certainly be the 1st of March before we start grafting. And if you know how to calculate your lag times from grafting to your first queen catch, you realize that we're going to be struggling to get those first queens off in the last week of March. And from there, we'll produce queens in large numbers up through the middle of June, and as long as we have significant drone populations into the summer. Some summers in Texas become so dry and so hot so early that by mid-July, we no longer have the necessary drone density to be able to successfully rear queens. So we'll take a hiatus and then resume queen rearing again once we get the late summer rains and the early fall bloom and produce.
And when you say large numbers, what does that mean?
Well, I mean, you really need to, you need to plan on having 20 to 30 drones for every queen you're trying to rear.
So large numbers of queens.
If you're gonna have an apiary where you want to be able to catch 500 queens, then you're going to have thousands and thousands of drones for those queens to mate with.
Right.
So if you and we do encourage our colonies to build drone comb and raise drone brood when the time is appropriate. But there come times when if you stop seeing drone brood in the colony, that you've only got about 3 weeks before you won't have any drones at all that are fit to mate. So you've got to be very careful about not trying to extend your queen production season into times when you don't have adequate numbers of drones.
In order to encourage the colony to produce drones, are you using drone comb or what do you do?
Yeah, we try to have some drone comb in all of our colonies. Naturally, our bees are going to build drone comb in colonies, particularly if you're not using plastic foundation that will affect their ability to do so. Not completely, but it'll retard it compared to.
Maybe like 20% of the frames are drone frames, if in the brood box. 2 out of 10.
I don't run full drone combs in colonies very often. We do in some, but I prefer a comb that's got about 1/4, 1/5 drone brood and have a number of those in our drone mother colonies, or maybe even a half comb of drone brood is a lot. But if you think about what you want to see in a colony I'm trying to gauge your part of the world, by mid-April in your part of the world, I think you're going to want, I don't know what is going on with these dings here, Fred. I apologize.
I'm not hearing them at all, so I think you're okay.
Okay, I'm okay. All right, good.
Yeah.
Somebody's going crazy on my messages. Maybe somebody is watching your YouTube channel. I think that's
Yeah,
what's
yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
happening.
Yeah, I knew there would be 5 or 6 people who would discover me one day.
Okay. Oh, goodness. So anyway, back to it. So drones, when do what do I mean by large numbers of drones? So
Mm,
I'm guessing by mid-April in your part of the world, your colony, you want to see like a fifth of the brood being drone brood
mhm,
if you're going to be trying to raise queens.
mhm,
Okay. So if you've got 5 combs of brood in the colony, you want to have, a fifth of each of those combs with drone brood on it. Or if you've
mhm,
got 10 combs of brood, then you're going to want to see 2 combs of almost complete drone brood.
mhm.
Now that's for people who are trying to rear large numbers of queens. I
Right.
mean, you can successfully have a supersedure event if all you've got is each of your 20 colonies with a couple of hundred drones, right?
Mhm,
You don't need enormous numbers.
right. But so for the year, how many queens do you ship out?
Trade secret. Sorry, can't tell.
Trade secret. Okay. More than 100. All right.
More than 100.
So,
Not as many as
okay.
we once. Not as many as we once did. We don't. We
Okay.
don't.
And
We don't produce 100,000 anymore.
you're saying that you're scaling back? What's in the future? What are your plans going forward?
Well, it's very interesting that you would ask that. And I have a grant proposal that I've recently submitted that I'm very hopeful will be funded. And the aim is to further accelerate our ability to select and verify that we've got bees that are resistant to deformed wing virus and other viruses.
Mhm.
And if that grant gets funded, I think I'll be moving more into the realm of trying to supply breeder stock to other
Okay.
queen
Yeah.
rearing operations around the country and around the world. We've already done a little bit of that, sort of informatively sharing ideas and sharing a little bit of
Mhm.
breeding stock. But I think that there's room for a new business model with what we've got here so that I might become more in the business of just supplying breeder queens, drone semen, and technical expertise to other queen breeders. I've got 3
Mm,
sons. It remains to be seen whether any of them want to pick up the reins and carry the family business forward. I mean, there's
mhm,
always the possibility that there could be some business entity change on down the pipe. But
mhm.
for right now, I think I'm going to hold the course for another 10 years at least.
Oh, good. 10 years works. And so, what do you want people to know about BeeWeaver, about your facility there? I think, are there classes being taught there, workshops, things like that? What should people know about BeeWeaver?
Yeah, we've been driven kicking and screaming into the era of educational and entertainment experiences revolving around bees and beekeeping. So we're doing more and more of that kind of thing.
Mhm,
And we offer private lessons, group lessons, educational workshops, specialty workshops. Like if you want to learn how to rear queens, we're going to be offering a 2-day course where you'll be completely immersed in a hands-on queen rearing experience
mhm,
in springtime. We've done that in the past. We've never tried to do it in spring before because we're so terribly busy already in
mhm.
spring.
Who
But
teaches the queen rearing class?
well, I'll be one of the
Okay.
instructors, as well as some of my more senior and trustworthy employees, knowledgeable employees.
You have trustworthy employees there. That's good to
Well, they're all trustworthy, but I mean
know.
trustworthy in the sense that they can bring um, many, many years of beekeeping expertise and knowledge to the table.
Mhm.
So you can be confident that they know what they're talking about. And yeah, they're really, good people and knowledgeable beekeepers.
Mhm. So what is your biggest challenge right now?
I think the biggest challenge right now is excessive herbicide application.
That's interesting.
excessive elimination of native plant communities by people who move into the country and buy parcels to get out of town. And then they come in and, bulldoze large tracts and spray lots of herbicides and try to get rid of all the plants and underbrush and want it to look like a golf course. That to me is like the biggest challenge facing beekeepers.
That's everywhere. Yeah.
Yep. It's a resource abundance issue. There's just not enough native plant or even exotic plant resources to sustain large pollinator populations.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to wreak havoc on the entire ecosystem if we don't do something more to fix it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. That is a big problem. Now, the number one complaint about BeeWeaver bees. Do you want to know what it is?
What is it?
Most of my people are beginning beekeepers and they can't just order a queen because they don't have bees. So you don't ship packages.
Packages. Yeah, we got out of that business.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. We used to ship tens of thousands of packages every year all over the country.
When did you stop doing that?
I can't remember exactly when we completely stopped, but we tried a variety of different things. We used to ship almost exclusively through the Postal Service and had really good success and only tolerable losses. And that all changed beginning back in the early O's. And we began to experience increasing percentages of packages that were put in the mail in great shape and never got to the destination alive. They were getting put in plastic bags by the Postal Service. They were getting left in semi trailers and parking lots with doors shut over the weekend. And it became, the losses became unsustainable. We tried doing other things. We shipped for a few years with UPS. We tried being our own delivery operation too. I was in the logistics business of personally carrying packages all over the countryside, and decided I didn't want to be in that business. So
yeah.
It became too much, and we frankly had so much demand that we could sell everything we could produce with people willing to drive in and pick them up. I mean, I know it's crazy and not everybody's in a position to do this, but there are some bee clubs around the country that actually hire somebody to get in a plane and fly down here and pick up a load of packages.
In a plane. Okay. I mean, I could see people are serious enough about it. I could see somebody driving down and making a big buy for the group if the group was big enough.
That happens. But,
and so you also now you do carry some other lines of queen bees, I think.
Well,
so are you brokering those, or are they?
Yeah, they're not reared here. They're not reared here. That what has happened is that luckily we have many customers all over the country, some of whom need early queens before we can produce them. And so we obtain queens from other people around the country that produce them earlier than we do. So some breeders in Southern California and breeders in Southern Florida that can produce bees before we can, or queens before we can. We buy and then resell some of their stuff.
Okay.
It used to be that it was possible to import bees from Australia. And when Australian bee and queen imports were possible, well, we did that. We brought in thousands and thousands of Australian packages and Australian queens for those people who wanted bees and queens in time for almond pollination in California. But beekeepers perceived that the risks of introduction of other unwanted pests were too great, and USDA was convinced to call a halt to that back about 2010, I think it was. So anyway, we no longer do that. But I did a lot of business with a good friend, probably the largest queen breeder in the world, certainly then, and I think maybe even still now, Warren Taylor. So anyway.
So my next question is, once you have mated queens and they don't ship right away, how long can they be banked? So
I've got queens that have been in a bank now since mid-October, and we're using them right now.
Okay.
we experience winter losses among those queens that we've banked over winter, but I don't think there's anything wrong with banking queens for 60 days and putting them to use. We routinely do that, and we're not afraid of it. Some people seem to think that queens that have been banked are not as good, or potentially not as good. But in my estimation, the queens that you can bank for 60 days and they're still viable, they don't die when they're in storage, are actually going to be excellent queens.
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of its own testing proving ground in itself. So how old are queens when do you breed for longevity? How old are the breeder queens?
I try to do that. Yeah. So I don't like using a queen as a breeder queen, that means a queen that I'm grafting from.
Right.
Or as a drone mother, unless they've been around for 2 years or more.
Okay. I like that number. Like it matters what I like, but
no, I mean, it's hard. If you draw the line in the sand at 3 years, there are too few queens that make it that long for us to have enough drone mothers at that age.
Well, I like that you said that, because that's what I tell people. Don't if you're even in a backyard apiary, go with the queens that are 2 years old, because they have longevity to survive your winters. They're adapting to your environment. They're doing okay. So those are the ones that we would split from.
I think you're making the right call there. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, that's pretty much all I have for you, Daniel. I appreciate that you took so much time to talk to me. And this is some very interesting background, and it gives people a lot of food for thought, I think. Is there anything in closing that you'd like to say, or some statement about beekeeping today? Anything?
Oh, I think beekeeping is so rewarding on so many different levels, and I encourage people to do it and try it. You may think you're an environmentalist and that you're in touch with nature, but nothing will make you more aware of your natural surroundings than becoming a beekeeper. And you get some amazing sensory experiences out of it too. And I think that there's nothing more calming and relaxing than working a colony of bees once you develop the skill set necessary to do it. Everyone experiences a normal level of anxiety and excitement when they're first getting started. But once you master a few of the basic skills, you'll discover that you can sort of enter this transcendental state of mind when you're working a colony of bees. And I think it's really good for your psyche and your mental health.
Oh, absolutely. That's why we have Hives for Heroes and Heroes for Hives and all these other groups, because it is a powerful influence on emotional and mental well-being. So I have one more. What's that?
I also wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity today to talk to you.
Yeah. Oh, you're welcome. I've been a fan of BeeWeaver for as long as I've been keeping bees. So I do have one more thing that just came to mind. I noticed that you guys ship apitherapy boxes.
Yes.
How did that come about? Was that just meeting a demand, or?
Yeah, just meeting a demand. We began to have people who had multiple sclerosis and other dire conditions knocking on our door wanting bees. And I am naturally skeptical of many of the claims that are made for the benefits of any healing regimen that is not rigorously proven with, control studies, lots of data. So I didn't really want to pitch it, but we wanted to take care of people who were coming to us and asking for help. And
right.
We got to witness firsthand some at least anecdotal experiences of a few people who were rather severely affected by their condition and that experienced dramatic improvement once apitherapy began. And that encouraged us to think that this was not a bad thing to do. So we now have them listed on our website. For years, you had to come knocking on the door to even find out we did it. But yeah.
Are those the workers that are shipped for apitherapy? Are they any different? Are they different from your standard stock? Are they just harvested out of any hive, or are they guard bees because they would be more prone to sting? Or
No, we don't select them any differently. We try to get bees that are the same bees that we would put in as nurse attendants in a queen cage
Okay.
if we were going to fill a shipping cage with a queen and baby bees. In fact, most of the apitherapy bees that we ship during the time of the year when we're caging queens are in fact the very same bees that we would put in the queen cage with the queen.
Okay. Okay. That's interesting. And what is the number one? I realize this is anecdotal. What's the number one malady that people seem to want apitherapy for? Is it arthritis?
Multiple sclerosis.
Multiple sclerosis. And they give you positive feedback on their experience with that. So you must have the same people buying bees over and over.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Do you recommend a book on apitherapy if somebody wanted to do a deeper dive?
No, I do not. And I'm sorry to say that I'm not as well educated on that topic as I should be.
Okay. No, that's fine. Well, thank you so much for spending a big part of your Friday with me. And I think we've got everything. So
okay.
Thank you and have a fantastic weekend, Daniel. Appreciate it.
I'll do it.
Okay.
Good to talk to you.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
So thank you for joining us today for another video and an interview with an expert, Daniel Weaver of BeeWeaver Apiaries. I hope you got some great information, and if you enjoy this format, please let me know by writing a comment down in the comments section. We'll do more in the near future. Thank you for being here. Have a great day.